Hey folks, it's me doing a little revision. So I've done one of these before, but I wanted to do one again. A kind of meta commentary on things I've been doing and thinking about and writing about. I'm in the kind of a middle of a hiatus right now where I'm trying to figure out what I want to do next. But I don't think I've made one of these in a while. Can't even really remember. Sometime made one of these first ones not too long ago. Pretty sure it was before the passing of my father. So if you've read some of that, that's been an ongoing issue. But I wanted to focus on four things that I kind of wanted to talk about. I'm not going to share all of it. Some of it can be read in the section below. But I wanted to start. So a couple things I've been working on recently. The first one is I've been really digging into Yuval Noah Harari's book Nexus. If anybody has been following along, you could perhaps have seen some of this stuff going on. I've included some of the links down below. I've written at least 6 times on it. I'm only in chapter 2, so talking about just stuff involving some of his material, getting into some of his discussion of the introduction, and chapter 1 and chapter 2, I'm pretty sure were both two-parters. So I will be definitely getting back to that. But the most recent one I did was this past Friday, where I've become really fascinated by this idea of intersubjective reality, and his discussions of it. And I ended up dedicating an entire post over to it on Friday. If you haven't gone by, that's the intersubjective reality of America. Talking about this idea that there is a place, a liminal place between, and I want to figure out going forward, I really want to tie this into comic books and maybe do some further research on this because I'm really fascinated. But the idea that there are things that are objective, the idea that there is objective reality, and that means that there is something that exists whether you realize it or are aware of it. Okay, it's almost like if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it. Well, guess what? It still happened. That's objective reality. The subjective reality would be whether or not you heard it or not if someone asked you. Subjective reality is dictated by how we come to view things in certain ways. And the funny thing and what I found so interesting about intersubjective reality is that these are things that are in a lot of ways subjective, but the subjectivity exists in a place of transition and communication through narratives and stories. So that's one. I've got a lot of the links in there if you want to check out some of that. I'm very interested about this, and I'm sort of taking it slowly with this book. I love Harari's work. I've been a big fan going way back for many of his works. I recently completed graphic novel. It was 3 volumes of his first major work, Sapiens, which I want to make a shout out here. I was not introduced to Harari in what you might consider a standard, typical way. I was introduced to Harari through a podcast, and not an intellectual podcast or a philosophy podcast. It's a sports podcast. It was originally the Around the NFL podcast. Was a big fan until they broke the band up back in last May. So it's kind of split up into things. But one of the members who passed away in this, I believe it was January of 2021, so it's been 4 years since his passing. Chris Wessling. Love his stuff. Heed the Call is the new podcast that I used to use as a signature phrase to pay tribute to him. But he's the one who actually introduced me to Sapiens. And now Heed the Call, which was his phrase, is the name of a podcast by 2 of his former fellow NFL writers, Dan Hanzus and Mark Sessler. I still follow their podcast because I'm big. It's the same way with Top Gear when Jeremy Clarkson and James May and Richard Hammond, they all got broken up, and they offered Hammond and May a chance to stay, and they left and to be in solidarity with their friend Jeremy Clarkson. They went on to do Grand Tour. So fun stuff there. But yes, so I will be continuing on that. So it's a thing that's kind of like become one of my new interesting things to dig into. Additionally to that brings us to my second topic I want to talk about, and this is my current engagement with a lot of short form writing project I'm kind of working on. I always realize that I have all these ideas for stories that are not necessarily full blown stories, and so what I'm kind of creating is somewhere between like short form epigrams to not quite short story length stuff. It's somewhere in its own liminal space, somewhere in between, and some of it even comes off in like poetry, which I'm okay with that. it has that. But I've done 2 posts on some innovations in writing and more short form writing. I've linked below, but I've also included some of my newer stuff. I'm not going to read them here, but you can go read them in the description, the rest of the post. I posted some of my new ones. Turned one of my things was something about Stuck in a Meeting. I've turned it into a series now because I go to a lot of meetings. But I've got Stuck in a Meeting 2 and Stuck in a Meeting 3. And then I've got another piece in here, 5 years, which is a reflection for me about my past, so in my life, I've had 2 major relationships, I would call them. I've had a couple relationships, not as many as some people, but I've had 2 major relationships. I consider them major relationships because in both situations I got engaged and I got married. The first one did not work out. But one of the interesting things about it, looking back on it, is how very short it was. And in fact, this year, 2025, in August, will mark 20 years since the start of the timer on that 5-year relationship, which is what led the relationship itself from meeting to dating to engaged to married to separate, divorced. Quick. Did not feel quick at the time, but it was quick, strangely enough. And then I've also included a couple, the last one I've included here is called 19th Century A-Holes, which is a complaint about how a lot of what we understand with history kind of got ruined in the 19th century by Victorians. So, thanks, guys. The last 2 things I want to talk about. Number 3 is processing grief and working on a new book proposal. I have posted about this, MCU Phase 4 and grief. I'm hoping over spring break to really dive into some research so I can finish the book proposal. I'm still interested in this, and even more so now with the passing of my own father. It's become kind of like a strange mission of mine that I definitely want to pursue this project. Even if it doesn't even get picked up by the publisher, I may still pursue it. So, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about, so this isn't going to be too terribly long, is some stuff that I'm working on that came out of a meeting recently, and it took me back. So my last topic here I have is English department versus everyone else. Arching is real. Now, I've been doing a Venture Brothers rewatch over with my group, The Not Funny Guys, on YouTube. I'll include a link to that below. I think most of you probably seen it if you follow me on Facebook or anywhere like there. But I've been thinking about this. It took me back to 2009 when I was in the early stages of my PhD program back in the day. And interestingly enough, what was really fascinating to me was I was big into Venture Brothers then too. It was one of my favorite shows, despite only coming out what seemed like every so often. But one of the things that I was a big fan about them was the fact that I loved the idea that somehow it came to me that being a PhD student for a professor was like being a henchman. And I was like, this idea got in my head, and what created my original Twitter handle, which was, my original Twitter handle was Arching with a PhD.